Hi everyone, welcome back to Casual Watch Review channel. Over the course of 2023, I visited Japan, went to the Grand Seiko Museum, or the Seiko Museum, saw almost every single modern Grand Seiko, and got to try on a lot of them as well. When I came back from Japan, I was obsessed with Grand Seiko. I ended up buying one in Japan, a vintage model, which I absolutely loved. And on my return, I bought a spring drive watch, which you know all about, and I also bought a 9F quartz. I happen to also own a Rolex Datejust, so I got to handle a lot of Grand Seikos last year, and I've also had a lot of experience with handling Rolexes and owning a couple, so I think I can confidently say, despite what endless YouTube videos are telling you, Grand Seiko is not better than Rolex, and I have got 7 reasons why I think that Grand Seiko is not better than Rolex, and I'd love to know in the comment section down below your view, and if there's any that you think I've missed. I'll start this by saying that I am a Seiko fan. I've got far more Seiko videos on my channel than I have Rolex. I am a Seiko fan. So less rambling, let's dive in with reason number 1, Lume. If you've owned a Grand Seiko, you know exactly what I mean. The Lume on the watches is not great. Certainly not great in terms of standard Seiko, and certainly not great in terms of Rolex. The Rolex Datejust that I have, the Lume on it is spectacular. It is a sports watch, similar to a lot of the Grand Seiko watches that just don't have any lume on them at all, or just have lume on the indices instead of those Zaratsu polished hands. But even on the watches that I've owned, the Grand Seiko watches that do have lume is much better on Rolex watches than it is on Grand Seiko watches. Number 2, wearability. You'll know my view on that Grand Seiko GMT that I had, where it was very poorly balanced, the case. From those comments in the comment section, there's a lot of you agreed with me about just how poorly balanced some of the cases on Grand Seiko are, and how it makes them quite difficult to wear. You will likely never experience that with a Rolex, except for maybe some of the professional ones. The Sea Dweller I know is quite a heavy watch, but the standard range that they have, the Datejusts, the Submariners, the GMTs, they all wear amazingly well. There is something that Rolex does with their cases that means that they wear like a glove. There's a lot of thought by Rolex put into how the watches wear, and I don't think that it happens at Grand Seiko, especially on the spring drive models. I think there's a bigger concentration on making sure they fit that beautiful spring drive technology in there than there is around the actual wearability of the watch. Arguably, you could go for a titanium version, which would really reduce the weight there, but consistently across the range, I think that Rolexes wear a lot better than Grand Seiko watches. Point number 3 leans into the wearability as well, and that is the bracelets. The bracelets on Rolex are some of the most comfortable watch bracelets you will ever wear. It's consistent across the Oyster bracelet, the Jubilee bracelet, the articulation in the bracelets, the glide lock on the Submariners, the system on the Datejust where you can notch it out a little bit. This is something that Grand Seiko does not do well, the wearability of their bracelets. Some of the sports models don't have any micro adjustment, let alone a ratcheting system on them. Now I have to say the bracelet on my 9F quartz Grand Seiko does wear really well. I wish it just had a little bit of micro adjustment. Modern Rolex watches, some of the best bracelets that you will see on any watch, let alone just in comparison to Grand Seiko. Number 4, this is the big one, probably the one I'm going to get the most comments on, but the resale value of Grand Seiko is awful. You could argue, well, in comparison to a Rolex, which does for the most part maintain its value, even for the less desirable ones, and makes money in terms of the more desirable ones, you could argue it's an unfair comparison. As much as Rolex gains in that department, Grand Seiko loses, because they are really not only difficult to resale afterwards, unless you've got one of the extremely popular ones like the Snowflake. Grand Seikos are not only hard to sell, but you also take a big hit on them. I lost quite a bit of money on a Grand Seiko, so this one does. This one hurts me personally, this one. Number 5, name recognition. A bit of an unfair comparison because Rolex is arguably one of the most noticeable brands in the world, let alone a watch brand. Most people know the Rolex name, but I would also say that Grand SEIKO. Because it still maintains SEIKO in its name, I think that gives more pause for thought for some buyers for a watch that they might be spending at minimum $3,000 right up to several hundreds of thousands of dollars. Probably a little bit unfairly here because Rolex is the big name brand in the US where I'm based. The name recognition of Rolex far outstrips that of Grand SEIKO. Number 6, I'm going to say, is serviceability of the watches. Rolex uses a consistent set of movements. You could easily get a Rolex serviced by taking it into a Rolex store, of which there is one in most major cities across the world. Grand SEIKO, the spring drive movement is still fairly new in comparison to the world of watchmaking, and to get it serviced you're either going to have to send it off to them in the post yourself, insure it, make sure it's going out, or take it into a Grand SEIKO store. There are more popping up. There are nowhere near as many as Rolex, as you'd expect, to be honest, because Rolex is a lot more established brand. There's a lot more ADs. Friction is a lot less to get it serviced than with Grand SEIKO. Technology moves forwards. Will you still be able to get vintage spring drives serviced? And an example of this is the SEIKO kinetic watches, which are very hard to get serviced because they have that capacitor in them. And although they were all the rage in the 90s, which is not that long ago in terms of watchmaking, now it's very expensive to get a SEIKO kinetic watch serviced, almost that expensive that it's not worth doing. This is present day me. I just had another thought when I was editing this that I haven't experienced Rolex servicing and I haven't experienced Grand SEIKO, so it's probably a little bit unfair, that one, but I did think of another one, and that is price. Rolex, even though they are very expensive, I think the pricing is reasonable in comparison to some of the other watches. They are by no means the top range watch that you can buy. They have consistent pricing in comparison to IWC, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Vacheron, for example, other sort of sports watch makers. Whereas Grand SEIKO, I think it's harder to work out why the watches cost what they cost, whereas I think for Rolex it's a little bit easier. There's a gold one, that's a little bit more. Oh, this is a sports model, a professional model, that's a little bit more. Whereas Grand SEIKO, it seems like some of the starting prices, especially for the new Evolution 9 movements, you think, wow, okay, well, why is that watch starting at $10,000? It's a little bit harder to work out why the watches cost what they cost. And sometimes you get quite the eye-opener on the pricing of Grand SEIKO when you see them. Pricing across the range is a lot more easier to understand with Rolex than it is with Grand SEIKO. So we'll call this point 6 as well. So let's go back to past me to do point 7. Number 7, this has to be the range of watches that are available. Rolex has a tight collection of watches, but there is something for everyone. Granted, it's more difficult on some of the sports models to actually get hold of one. In terms of the models that they have in the range, multiple different sizes of certain watches, which Grand SEIKO don't do very well. A lot of ladies' watches, which again, Grand SEIKO don't have a large number of ladies' watches or smaller watches. Rolex Datejust ladies versions, probably one of the best selling ladies' watches in the world. Grand SEIKO also has a lot of individual collections that don't seem to cohesively come together. Some of the lines they don't seem to add new collections to. There is less of a theme than there is to Rolex. Rolex at least have a consistent theme, and not all the Rolex watches sell well, but with Grand SEIKO it seems like it's hard to really, other than the snowflake, point your finger on, wow, this is their big seller. Grand SEIKO do a lot of experimentation, which Rolex don't really do. They have that continuous force tourbillon, they have the tentograph that they've worked on as well. Rolex consists to their bread and butter, but I would argue that they have something for everyone in the Rolex collection if you can get hold of it, whereas Grand SEIKO, I don't think there's something for every taste in their collection. What did you think? Let me know in the comments section down below. I'm interested to know if you agree with me, if you disagree with me. Really appreciate you watching. See you next time on Casual Watch Reviews.